And good morning, everyone. Happy Friday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings here on Now TV. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and I do appreciate you being with me so very, very much. You know, we are continuing what is a really, really important study. The dispensational paradigm dominates modern Christianity. And of course, that's kind of ironic because before the 19th century, dispensationalism, as it is known today, the current iteration of it, was completely unknown. Now, that does not disprove it. Let's be honest here. The fact that dispensationalism did not appear until the 19th century does not in and of itself prove anything. And again, we have to be objective here. Because the fact of the matter is, there was a great apostasy and a loss of the understanding of biblical truth, especially in regard to eschatology. And that occurred even within the pages of the New Testament. Paul had to write in Romans chapter 11, and to correct the Gentile misunderstanding. The Gentiles were saying, oh, you know what? God's already through with Israel. Israel has no more future. It's all about the Gentiles now. And I have to tell you, just this morning on YouTube, I was answering an individual who told me that the gospel is all about the Gentiles. It's not about Israel. And he said, when you keep harping on the fact that Christ died for the Jew first, then you're trying to imply that Christ died only for the Jews and not the Gentiles, or you're completely cutting the Gentiles out. And I'm going, where did this kind of logic come from? I mean, I was literally stunned when I read it. This individual claims to be a, quote, scholar of sorts. And yet, to say that the gospel is primarily for the Gentiles and not Israel completely overlooks the fact that Paul said, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God for salvation unto all men, to the Jew first, then to the Greek. And it completely overlooks the fact that according to the Tanakh, the Old Testament, salvation would not flow to the nations until Israel was restored. That's Amos 9:11 and following, which is verified in Acts chapter 15, 9 and following. I mean, it's just incredible that someone who claims to be somewhat of a Bible expert would say, well, if you say that Christ died for Israel first, then you're espousing an Israel-only doctrine, and you're denying that the gospel is for the Gentiles. That is the epitome of ridiculous argumentation. Nothing could be, I'm sorry, you'll just have to excuse me here, nothing could express more ignorance than that claim. And I don't mean to be unkind, but I mean, this is truly an argumentum ad desperatum. There is no validity to it whatsoever. So, back to the point. Dispensationalism is the dominant paradigm in the religious world today. Now, amillennialists reject it, postmillennialists reject it, but dispensationalism is still the most popular eschatological view in the Christian world today. And listen to me very, very carefully. As we continue our discussion of the challenge of Christ, in which Jesus said, if I do not do the works which my Father has given me, do not believe me. That work was to establish the kingdom. Dispensationalism. I've been, going back over some dispensational writings over the last couple of weeks. Dispensational writers, the dominant, the prominent, the most famous, all say Jesus came to establish the kingdom in fulfillment of Daniel 9, 24 through 27. But due to Jewish unbelief, he could not establish the kingdom. Therefore, God withdrew the kingdom offer, postponed the kingdom, and inserted a so far 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9. Now, that means, ladies and gentlemen, let me reiterate this. That means simply, purely, undeniably, Jesus failed. Let me say again, okay? I understand, I acknowledge, I fully appreciate the fact that you will not get a dispensationalist to say overtly, oh, well, yeah, Jesus failed in his mission. But as I have pointed out to you, ladies and gentlemen, anytime you say God chose the time for Jesus to come to establish the kingdom, Jesus came at just the right time to establish the kingdom, but in spite of God's omniscience, in spite of God's plan, and in spite of Jesus' mission, to do the works that the Father gave him to do, Jewish rejection made it impossible for Jesus to fulfill his mission. Now, I shared with you in a previous video how Pompey, a prominent member of the original triumvirate in Rome, Pompey was not a known general, not a known conqueror. Crassus was, Julius Caesar was. So here's Pompey, who was one of the richest men in all of the Roman Empire, decided, hey, you know what? I'm going to go over and I'm going to whip the Carthaginians. Now, think about this, ladies and gentlemen, in regard to the mission of Christ. Pompey looked at Carthage. He set the time. He made the plans. When the time was right, he thought, he marched his large army into the Carthaginian, Parthian territory, and he was utterly defeated. He couldn't destroy the Carthaginians. The Parthians, excuse me. It is Parthians. As a matter of fact, he was captured, and as punishment, guess what they did? They held him down and they poured melted gold down his throat, obviously killing him. Now let me ask you, here's Pompey, who made all the plans, chose the right time, he thought, embarked on his mission, invaded Parthia, but he died. Did he fail? Would you call that a failure? By any standard. And yet, dispensationalism agrees, pardon me, God set the time to send his Son to establish the kingdom. His Son came at that appointed time that the Father had decreed and declared and predicted was the right time to establish the kingdom. Jesus offered the kingdom to the Jews, and he did that within the time frame of the 70-week countdown of Daniel chapter 9. But the Jews rejected him unexpectedly. Evidently, God didn't see it coming. Because after all, God thought the time was right to establish the kingdom. So unexpectedly, the Jews rejected the kingdom, killed the Lord Yahweh's Son, and so God withdrew the kingdom offer, postponed the 70-week countdown, and is waiting for, just the right time Oh, wait. He thought it was just the right time before. But he's supposedly waiting for just the right time, at which, guess what? He'll send his son the second time to establish the kingdom. Why are we supposed to believe that Jesus can do at his second coming what he could not do at his first, keeping in mind that even the dispensationalists tell us that the 70-week countdown was correct in the first century, ladies and gentlemen? The coming of Christ to establish the kingdom was right on time in the first century. And yet, according to the view of dispensationalists, he could not do what the Father gave him to do, even though he came at just the right time, even though he came at the appointed time, even though he came at the calculated prophetic right time. And yet again, we are told, well, you know what? At his second coming, he'll do what he couldn't do the first time. Ladies and gentlemen, think about that. Let me ask again, why should we believe that Jesus will be able to do the second time what he was unable to do the first time? You can't argue, well, the second time will be the right time. The first time, his first coming, was just the right time. You can't argue, well, things will be different the second time around. Did God not know all of the contingencies surrounding the first coming of his Son? Ladies and gentlemen, the great and the vast majority of dispensationalists, and I say this as kindly and respectfully as possible, the great majority of dispensational people, and believe you me, I have encountered thousands in my lifetime. I encounter them on Facebook and YouTube on a daily basis. It is utterly amazing to me how few of these, quote, normal pew-packing dispensationalists are actually fully aware of what the true doctrine of dispensationalism really is. When you point out that dispensationalism is built upon the foundation of a failed first coming of Christ, many of them literally recoil in horror. No, I don't believe Jesus failed. Well, I understand you don't believe that and that you would never say that. But here's what the doctrine says. Here's what the leaders of dispensationalism say. God chose the time. Jesus came at the appointed time, but he couldn't accomplish it. So again, I have been sharing with you over the last several weeks the question of, is there a gap of so far 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9? Because if there is no gap, ladies and gentlemen, then Jesus was absolutely accurate and true when he said, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven has drawn near. Okay, well, most dispensationalists say, well, that was early in his ministry. He was accurate. The time was right. The time was fulfilled. The 69th week had ended. Okay. If the 69th week had ended, then the 70th week was in its countdown. And yet, they tell us, no, not really. The 69th week had to end at the cross because that's when God suspended the countdown. No, we're told 483 years brings us to the baptism of Christ. Do you see the disparity? Do you see the contradiction? Do you see the inconsistency? You can't say that the 69th week ended in 483 BC, or excuse me, after 483 years at the baptism of Jesus, and then say, oh, well, no, wait, the 69th year ended at the cross. Sorry, that's 3.5 years. So, I have been posing this question. Is there a gap between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel? For the last 2 weeks, I've introduced what is my chart number 6 in a series of charts exploring the question of, is there a gap between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel? And by the way, thank you for all of the private messages expressing gratitude for exploring these questions, or this basic question, is there a gap between the 69th and the 70th week? Several of you have asked, where can I find those charts? Well, you can find the charts in my 2021 revised, enlarged, updated book, Sealant Vision and Prophecy. It's available on my website, donkpreston.com, bibleprophecy.com. Now, here we are, January the 21st, 2022. For the rest of this month, U.S. orders only. If you order $25 or more, and again, this is U.S. orders only, $25 or more, you'll get a 15% discount plus free shipping. Now, if you want the charts, okay, the charts are in this book, unless I've forgotten. But no, the information is there. So take advantage of this fantastic special offer to save yourself 15% on orders of $25 or more, plus free shipping, which puts the discount of over 20%. So, the last 2 weeks, I have introduced the following. If there is a gap of so far 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9, then the establishment of the kingdom in the first century would have altered God's plan. So, if there is a gap, then the establishment of the kingdom in the first century would have altered God's plan. And you're going, oh, why is that so? Well, okay, Daniel 9, 70 weeks are determined. Dispensationalism says, in that 70-week countdown, there is a 2,000-year gap between the 69th and the 70th week. Well, that 2,000-year gap takes us beyond Jesus' generation. It takes us beyond the ministry of John the Baptizer, who said, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is drawn near. That 2,000-year gap takes us to our time. So, if there is a gap of 2,000 years in the text of Daniel chapter 9, then that gap would have brought us to the 21st century, and thus the establishment of the kingdom in the first century would have been premature, and it would have altered God's plan. Now, I hope that you'll be turning in your Bible to Psalms 89, because in just a few moments we're going to be going to Psalms 89. But now let's look at the reverse, or the opposite of, if there is a gap, then the establishment of the kingdom, if there is a gap, then the establishment of the kingdom would have altered the plan. Now let's look at the reverse of that. If there is no gap, okay, if there's no gap between the 69th and the 70th week, then the postponement of the kingdom, in other words, an insertion of 2,000 years between the 69th and the 70th week, necessitated by the rejection of Christ by the Jews, then that's an alteration of the plan. Because if there's no gap in between the 69th and the 70th week, then the countdown brings us to the first century, and Jesus' promise, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is drawn near, demands the establishment of the kingdom in the first century. And you say, no, but Don, see, it was that rejection that caused the kingdom to be postponed. But wait a minute. Postponement means there was no gap. Postponement means God altered the plan. The plan was the kingdom was to be established in the first century. Jewish unbelief altered the plan and puts the establishment of the kingdom in our future. Oh, and of course, as I pointed out last week, we are told, every few years, oh, this is it. This is it. This proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, this generation will see the coming of the Lord, the judgment. This generation will see the rapture. Do you remember the book, Charting the End Times, by Thomas Ice and Tim LaHaye? Oh, it came out somewhere around 2005, if memory serves me correct. And in one of the chapters of that book, they examined the events of 1948, and they said that the, quote, restoration of Israel, unquote, in 1948 was the super sign of the end. Well, let's see. Hal Lindsey, even Thomas Ice, and most of the dispensational writers down through the years, until they had to recalculate, admitted that a generation was 40 years. Okay, so let's see here. 1988, Countdown to Armageddon by Hal Lindsey. What did Hal Lindsey say in that book? Hal Lindsey said, a generation is 40 years. And the super sign of the end, that was not Hal Lindsey's term, but he did believe that the restoration of Israel in 1948 was the key, pivotal, foundational, greatest sign that we are in the last days. So Hal Lindsey calculated, and he wrote 1980s. Countdown to Armageddon. 1988 was the year he chose. You know why? Okay, the restoration of Israel in 1948 was the super sign of the end, the proof positive that the coming of the Lord would be in that generation. You add 40 years to 1948 and you get what? Oh, my math's not too great, but I think that comes out to 1988. Well, guess what? The rapture did not occur in 1988. The abomination of desolation did not occur in 1988. The Great Tribulation did not occur in 1988. World War III, in other words, did not break out in 1988. Nothing that Hal Lindsey predicted came true. And do you know what? In 1990, I was sitting in front of my TV watching an interview with Hal Lindsey. And he was talking about the dissolution of Russia. And he was talking about the events of those days. And he said, I want to tell you right now, I predicted every bit of this in my book, 1980s Countdown to Armageddon. I literally jumped up, pointed my finger at the TV and said, you are lying. Pretty sure he didn't hear me. But ladies and gentlemen, Hal Lindsey knew. He predicted none of those things. Not one of them. Russia was supposed to invade Israel, 1988, or very, very, very shortly afterwards. So instead of being the great invasion force to come into Israel, Hal Lindsey sat on TV and told a bold-faced lie that he predicted the dissolution of Russia in his books. And he did no such thing. Ladies and gentlemen, this is blatant dishonesty. Now, I have to hurry here. So, how did Lindsay try to cover his tracks? Oh, he wrote another book, sold millions of copies, and said, well, some people believe that a generation is 40 years. However, biblically, a generation is 125 years. That's absolutely, utterly, 100% false. No merit to it whatsoever. But you know what? That covers him. That allows him to continue writing false predictions, stirring up fear, making more millions of dollars. He will die, and 125 years from 1948 will pass by. The Lord will not have come. The abomination of desolation, the great tribulation, none of that will occur. And Hal Lindsey will simply pass off the scene. Will his followers finally wake up? Will the followers of dispensationalism that proclaim and declare a failed eschatology, a failed Jesus, and remember the challenge of Christ? If I do not do the works that my Father has given me, do not believe me. What was the work the Father gave him to do? The Father gave him the mission, the task, the duty to come and to establish the kingdom in the first century. Okay, why is this so important? Psalms 89:34, and I got to hurry here. My covenant I will not break, nor alter the word that has gone out of my lips. Once have I sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. His seed shall endure forever, and his throne as the sun before me. It shall be established forever like the moon, even like the faithful witness in the heaven. Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a gap, then the establishment of the kingdom in the first century altered the plan. If there's not a gap, the postponement of the kingdom created an alteration, and God lied. I'm out of time. See you then.